obviously language is the true love, and that's why I write. I think that my visions are merely vehicles in order to be able to use the language. The language is the substance and the meaning and the form of everything.
Hello, I'm George Plimpton, and this is Writer's Workshop, where our guest today is a very unusual writer whose novels have become something like underground favorites in college English departments all over the country. His name is John Hawkes, and not only are his books different, but his writing schedule is also about as unusual as anything I've ever heard about. Hawkes teaches writing for 2 years at Brown University in Rhode Island, and then every third year he goes away to some exotic place, as far removed from Rhode Island as one can imagine, someplace like the south of France. And he writes a novel, and instead of focusing on character or plot, he starts his fiction with an imaginary landscape, a place that never was except in his very active imagination. Despite all this, John Hawkes claims he leads a perfectly normal life, or as normal as a writer can lead. And that's the kind of life he recommends for other writers, which will be encouraging for some beginners who may have thought that they had to go out and shoot big game or sail the 7 seas before they could produce a work of fiction. So an ordinary life and extraordinary fiction, that's the combination we'll hear Hawkes advocate as he talks with William Price Fox and the students on Writer's Workshop at the University of South Carolina.
I really am interested in pornography itself, especially visual pornography. People argue that either the sexual revolution is over or that it's merely destroying sexuality, that it makes sexuality so banal. And I've heard, I know a Swedish woman who argues that in Sweden, sexual images are so generally everywhere that it becomes a bore. Well, I certainly would deplore that state of affairs. It won't happen in the United States, not for quite a while.
Won't happen here.
No, won't happen here. But I like pornography simply because, first of all, I was once on a panel with a psychiatrist and the publisher of Evergreen Books, Barney Rossett, and other people at Harvard. And the psychiatrist and Rossett and myself and a few others were defending pornography against all kinds of outrage. And the psychiatrist thought that, again, this pornography is really a release of sexual impulses which otherwise might be dangerous. So there is a kind of therapeutic quality to it. But I think that pornographic books really engage the imagination, and they must engage the imaginations of millions of people, or at least hundreds and thousands of people, who are in some sense limited. They engage my imagination. I haven't read that much pornography, though.
You've said that you're concerned in your fiction with exposing, knowing, experiencing, and even accepting the darker sides of life and the darker human impulses. Do you think this process is helped by leading a seemingly conventional life or a seemingly stable life?
I think so. Yes, Mark.
How about a dark life?
I lead a perfectly ordinary life with Sophie and our 4 lovely children, who are really out of the family, out of the household by now. But an ordinary life is the life most conducive, I think, to artistic activity. Why, there's a Cyril Connolly line in one of his autobiographical books about the perambulator in the hall is the death to art. I think he's wrong. I like the perambulator in the hall. And now my children are old enough to actually appreciate my fiction and give me more sustenance. But I do believe in a perfectly ordinary life. life has been good to me recently, so that every third year we go away and I write. So I only write 1 out of 3 years and teach intensely, as intensively as I can, the other 2 years. And when we go away, usually to the south of France, that's a little exotic and perhaps not ordinary life. Yet even there, we don't know anybody, and we live in isolation. Sophie working on French, me trying to write fiction. I've always liked the idea of the writer as ordinary person. And I think Bernard Malamud and John Barth and William Gass are all simply people. You know, there's no role playing, no cigarette and whiskey of the 30s and so on.
During the third year when you're writing, what's your routine like?
It's very pleasant. We get up early, and I'm at work by 8 o'clock or 7:30. Recently, the last few years, I've found it increasingly difficult to stay in a writing situation. So what was once 4 or 5 hours in the morning devoted to writing has become 3 or 4. At any rate, we work in the morning. Sophie on her French studies and me writing fiction, and then we have a glorious lunch in the midst of roses and wine, and then we walk, hike, explore, whatever. And I like always going to a foreign terrain, a landscape that is, in a sense, the landscape of the imagination. I like being somewhere else when I write.
During those 2 years when you aren't writing then, are you constantly aware of ideas coming to you for that third year?
Only recently has that happened. I wrote Second Skin in the West Indies, and there was a lot of preliminary work before writing it, and I had a pretty good sense of that novel. And thereafter, through The Blood Oranges, Death, Sleep, and the Traveler, and Travesty, and The Passion Artist, I didn't really know, in each case, what I was going to write as we set off to write. And it's only now that I have a sense of my pornographic novel that I plan to write next year.
We'd all be interested, I'm sure, to know how you got started as a writer.
By accident, purely by accident. In high school, I was writing poetry. And when I first got to college, I was trying to write poetry. But then in the summer of 1947, after I had finished 2 years of college, I was in the class of 1947, didn't graduate till 49. In the summer of 47, I met Sophie, and we and I were in Fort Peck, Montana, where her father was in the Army Engineers, and we got married. And at that same moment, I got athlete's foot because I wanted a pair of cowboy boots. I'm envying your boots, Bill.
Damn right. Well, you might.
They're lovely. Well, I told somebody that I wanted a pair of boots, and they sent us out into the middle of the desert in Fort Peck, Montana, to a little adobe hut. And in the center of the hut, the only thing in the hut was a pair of wrinkled, little old black cowboy boots. And I took them, put them on, and immediately got athlete's foot from them. I guess out of myth comes terror as well as pleasure. At any rate, I had to sit for weeks with my feet in a bucket of potassium permanganate, and I was very bored. So Sophie gave me a book called The Thinking Reed, and I said I could do better. And she gave me a tablet, a children's tablet and a pencil, and I began to write a short novel satirizing her parents, my parents, and ourselves. And that's how I began to write fiction. And when I went back to college, I met Albert Gerard, got into his writing class. Soon afterwards, he said that my work was going to be published, introduced me to James Laughlin. So wife, teacher, publisher, all came together for me at the moment when I had 2 more years of college to go. That was sort of a beginning. And then I finished The Cannibal by the end of that year. So I wrote my first 2 short novels in a writing class.
Will you say something about the incomplete people that keep turning up in your books? Amputees, one lung missing. Why so?
I'm interested in imperfection. I think that the most interesting aspects of life lie in imperfection. There is a wonderful image in André Breton's book Nausea, about an abandoned locomotive in a jungle. And I came across that image very early in my writing life, 30 years ago, and trees and lush flowers and flowering vines all rise up and through and out of this great, immobile, dead, rusted locomotive. And that, for me, that locomotive contains the essence of locomotive far more than a real one speeding down a track. And so I became interested in the idea that the imperfect really conveys the essence of perfection more than a whole object. There's another quotation that my wife found for me, an epigraph by George that goes something like, the vase gives shape to nothingness, music to silence. And I love that idea, which is related to the ruined locomotive. All that we conceive of comes out of nothing and will go to nothing. And to me, this stillness and nothingness points up all that we create. I think we live by our imaginations and really come from nothing and will go to nothing. And we create so much fabulous life out of space and silence. So I can appreciate works of art more if I think of the cosmos of nothingness that they come from.
In Travesty, you say that woman is destined to unfulfillment. Is that really true? Do you believe that?
Destined what?
For unfulfillment.
Does it say that in Travesty? I don't remember.
It's in there, black and white.
I don't remember.
You're down south now.
Is this part of the repression that you're interested in?
What?
Is this
Read it
part of
to
the
him.
repression that... Well, I don't have my glasses. Read it, Joy.
I wouldn't recognize it, I'm sure.
Let's see, a certain intelligence in the eyes, but finally the undeniable indications of the female life that is destined, after all, for unfulfillment, which is not interesting.
So there.
Who's he talking about? Yeah. Who's he talking about? Is he talking about his wife? Because I don't remember.
That's on the dust
It's
jacket.
a nice passage, but I don't remember it. Right? Honorine?
Honorine, yes.
The narrator's talking about his wife, and he says
Yes.
he means that female life is generally, to him, unfulfilled. He's talking about all the oppressive forces, I guess, against women. But I think he thinks that Honorine is going to shift her role from muse to artist. So she will be fulfilled. Maybe we ought to make clear that this short novel is about a man driving a fast car through the night in the south of France, in order to kill his best friend, his daughter, and himself. And the reason he's doing this is to discover what it's really like to exercise the imagination. Ultimately, he knows that his wife, who will remain alive, she's sleeping in the chateau while the car speeds toward doom. He knows that his wife will reconstruct this essentially absurd or gratuitous act, and in understanding it, will become an artist. So Honorine will finally be fulfilled.
What does it accomplish to, you say, examine all the darker sides and destroy repression? And what kind of effect is this having? Is this eventually healthy? Or?
Of course, sure, it's healthy. It's
what
healthy,
way?
necessary, but involves beauty. I met a marvelous man in Colorado at Kalamazoo College, and we became friends, strong friends, almost instantaneously. And he told me a story about how when he was in the South Pacific during the Second World War, on an island so constructed that they couldn't bury the dead. The coral, it was simply impossible to bury anyone. And he said that one day he noticed that golden maggots were coming out of a corpse. And he said that at that moment he discovered what life really is. And he loved those maggots. He loved the golden quality of them. And he said that that's the beauty of my fiction, that it exposes and structures and organizes and in a sense makes beautiful all our latent terrors and potentialities for failure and so on. And it's not just to prettify or make pretty what is disgusting. It's to find the essential beauty of all of life. I've always been sort of driven toward the nightmare, although I've written some pretty comic fiction.
What is your fascination with terror, and why comic terror? What's the relationship between the two that you have found in your...
Well, I wish Don Greiner were here to talk about comic terror. Well, my fiction pretty obviously came out of the Second World War. And I don't think I've ever really gotten very far away from that extraordinary cataclysm. So horror on a grand scale, on an international scale, sort of set off all my residues of horror and terror. I think, childhood terror is perhaps the source of my fiction. And I think it's necessary to expose all of our weaknesses, all of our darker sides, because they too are natural. As I said, I'm interested in destroying repression wherever possible. Comedy, as I say, I didn't plan to write comic novels until Second Skin. But my fiction, until Second Skin, was comic. I thought it was comic. Not too many reviewers thought it was comic. They just thought it was horrible. Horrific, disgusting, nightmare-like, not worth readers and so on, or something readers should keep away from. At any rate, the comedy, I think, is a way of containing pain, of exposing the grace of the sufferer. Whether it's farce, I think fiction is a form of revenge. I think fiction, in a sense, involves injury. It involves as much pain as pleasure. And the reader brings his own sack of horrific materials to the work. I don't know, Goya, what are some of the other painters that I would obviously be related to? I can't. Bruegel. I can't think of much more about comedy. Yeah, Bosch.
Yeah, Bosch.
Yeah.
Rather than Bosch.
Yeah. Why comedy? I don't know. In a way, comic thinking lends itself perhaps most readily to the grotesque. Or perhaps it would be impossible, in a sense, for me, to keep dealing with painful materials if they did not involve a kind of comic detachment. My work is very detached. The writer is very detached as he tries to create these visions.
You said your work was influenced by childhood terrors, your childhood terrors, I would have to assume. What were your childhood terrors that have influenced you to write novels that are so unusual and moving or whatever?
One of my earliest memories, I don't have any more lovely childhood terrors than anybody else, and probably not as good as some. I never saw a parent kill another parent, for instance, as young children have. At any rate, one of my earliest recollections is being in a crib with asthma, in an asthma attack with a whole little army of toy soldiers and a little hatchet, and I destroyed the entire army with the greatest pleasure. And that was probably my first authorial moment. And then I remember having asthma when we were living next to a riding stable, and I used to hear the horses all during the night thumping and moving and making their great soft sounds. And I got a job working in the stable, and I was terrified of those horses. I was always afraid of being kicked or stepped on or squashed, in a stall. But I loved them. And I don't know how much terror. There is real terror in being very small near a gigantic horse. But I loved the power and terror of those horses. And of course, I loved the sense of security of being in bed while they were moving in ghost-like fashion nearby.
You mentioned James Laughlin. How important was he in the development of your career, and how did you happen to leave him for the new publisher of your latest novel?
As I said, Ben, I met Laughlin when I was about 23 or 24 years old through Albert Gerard, and Laughlin immediately said that he wanted to publish my work. He used to send me postcards from India, say, or the French Alps. He's a great skier, and he used to send me little postcards from all over the world saying, "My, you can write." And I was still a junior in college. Laughlin created my life. 3 people created my life: Sophie, Albert Gerard, and J. Laughlin. Laughlin, as you know, is an extraordinary publisher, and for 30 years he published my work and supported me on these various trips and encouraged me emotionally. He always insisted on the merit of my work. He's a wonderful, remarkable man. The reason that I shifted to Harper & Row only last year is because I finally decided that my work, of all the writing in this country, I thought that my work was significant and not reaching enough people. And I really thought it was necessary to try to work with a larger publisher. And Harper & Row was the first publisher we tried, and they published The Passion Artist and want to publish my next novel.
Talking about the process of writing, you've mentioned that you start with an idea with some novels. Does a character ever come out strong to you? Does it happen that the character appeals to you in the beginning and that's what gets you started and helps develop the storyline?
Generally not. I start, I think, from idea or concept and landscape. I'm interested in writing what I want to read, and I'm interested in creating my own world. I like the author's authority to be in total possession of a created world. I think John Barth once remarked that God was a pretty good inventor, except that he was a realist. I love the remark. I like to create worlds, and so it's fragments of landscapes that I've never seen before that I start with, really sort of literal visions, and then try to create an entire world from. Of course, Second Skin depended very much on its narrator, but I'm not really interested in character creation in a more traditional sense.
How do you set it up? Do you have to
I think
research
by the time I'm actually writing a novel, I think of the novel while I'm shaving, and then proceed. I wouldn't want to suggest that my work has anything to do with automatic writing. It doesn't. I'm not interested in some kind of automatic flow of words or stream of consciousness. My fiction is carefully and consciously controlled, but on the other hand, I don't work from outlines, and often I don't know where a particular scene is going, as I said. So each day's work begins in a kind of terror, of anxiety, and ends with fatigue and a need for snails and roses and cheese.
What intrigues you about university teaching?
Simply trying always to emulate my former teacher. But it's, as you can imagine, a powerful experience to be working with younger writers as they exercise their imaginations, find their own materials, and begin to love language. Obviously, language is the true love, and that's why I write. I think that my visions are merely vehicles in order to be able to use the language. The language is the substance and the meaning and the form of everything. And it's extraordinary to see the development of students. And of course, whether it's a fiction writing class or some other kind of writing class, the sheer educational power of it is obvious.
What's the most exciting thing that's going on in like American fiction writing right now? What's the most disturbing to you in the kind of the way the novel's going, whatever? Because you've been in the forefront for years, I guess.
It's a hard question for me to quicken to. I think we all know about postmodernist fiction, I think that Barth, Gass, Coover, and so on are involved in writing a fiction that ultimately is fulfilling in some different way. And oddly enough, I think that this fiction is actually our traditional fiction now. I think that such fiction is read widely. I think that that students thrive on it and love it. I can't think of what's worse. Perhaps just debasement in the publishing world. But I read very little, Will. I lead an isolated life.
You read Marquez at all?
I did,
What'd
yes.
you think of
100 Years of
Yeah,
Solitude. Oh, magnificent.
Good.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
He has his ship in the middle of the
Yeah,
forest.
same
with
as your
roses-
locomotive, yeah.
Roses growing
Yeah.
out of it. Yes, it's a lovely work.
That's a required book down here. We require that in class.
I think that most people would assume, I think now, it's hardly even worth talking about, that the novel form has changed. Narrative may still be a prime necessity, but fiction is self-conscious in a new way, is self-conscious of itself as art form. I think that the country's appreciation of language is overwhelming. You know, lots of universities and colleges want to have writers around, and I think that relates to our general phenomenon of a whole new literary era in the United States that began with the end of the war.
Any advice to students coming up now, whether going to journalism or not, or English courses or archaeology? Or...
I found English important, and one of my own greatest lacks was not reading Shakespeare, not taking a Shakespeare course. I think everybody ought to read Shakespeare, and I really don't have much advice to new writers, except, of course, to do it, to keep writing, always to write, and to write on schedule. It is a discipline like everything else. I myself think it's better not to be too concerned about publishing when you're young, except recently some extremely good writers in the graduate program at Brown are publishing in Atlantic and Harper's, and I can see that it's important. But I think I spent so many years in a sense out of any sense of the publishing business or publishing world that I feel inexpert in it. I'm interested in purity. I'm a purist. And I think one must devote oneself to the language and the particular story.
This is George Plimpton thanking you for participating in our Writers' Workshop. Please join us again next time.